Minutes to look at our opening slide, so let's move on. So this theme of from the glaciers to the oceans is obviously very broad, but we should maybe start by acknowledging how extraordinarily important Tibet is. The metaphors that we so often use are roof of the world, Asia's water tower, but it's quite extraordinary if we just think only of the rivers that connect the glaciers to the oceans. Which oceans? It's an extraordinary range of oceans, from the Indian Ocean, Arabian Sea, Bay of Bengal, Andaman Sea, South China Sea, the West Pacific and the North Pacific. That's an extraordinary span of the world's oceans that are watered by Tibet, and of course Tibet draws those oceans' waters to it. So it's a cycle. If we start from the top of the roof, we've all seen pictures of the now dramatically melting glaciers, and I hope this picture conveys that sense of glaciers that are now rapidly decaying and losing their mass, diminishing so rapidly that Chinese meteorologists look forward to the day when Tibet, to put it simply, is more like China, more suitable for Chinese agriculture, warmer and wetter, and therefore easier for Chinese people to live and to do Chinese-style farming and so on. I'm sure we're all familiar with pictures of these slow-moving but constantly moving rivers of ice. So I don't think we need to spend a lot of time at the very top of the roof. And we may not spend a lot of time either at the oceans, but we do need to remember that this is a cycle. So the winds that bring, amazingly, billions of tons of water floating through the sky to Tibet, to fall on Tibet, and then to rush down the steep mountain rivers and to finally through the plains and down to the sea. The Indus, the Yarlung Tsangpo Brahmaputra, the Galmang-Uchu Salween, the Zachu Mekong, the Drichu Yangtze, the Machu Yellow River. It's an extraordinary range of rivers that all rise in Tibet. But where does the water come from? It comes from the same oceans. It is an endless seasonal cycle. So while we're talking about the rivers rushing down, at the right time of the year, the clouds come in from the oceans. So these are, especially the map at the top, on the top right, shows us the winds that bring the monsoon, the Indian monsoon, and also the Southeast Asian and East Asian monsoons that draw, as I said, on rivers of sky rivers, billions of tons of water. How is that possible? What drives those clouds inland? We can understand that in the tropics, it's only natural that some of the water in the oceans evaporates and becomes clouds. But what draws those clouds in? It is Tibet. It is specifically around about this time of the year, March, April, as spring arrives, and the bare rock of the high country the upper country in Tibet starts to heat up, and bare rock under an intense sunshine in thin air of high altitude, bare rock heats up quite dramatically. And that's not necessarily the image that we usually have of Tibet. Usually we think of Tibet as a cold place, and for much of the year it is. But Tibet also heats up really dramatically. So these are the prevailing winds of Tibet. Down the bottom is the South Asian monsoon winds that come in from the Bay of Bengal and the Indian Ocean. There are westerlies on your left the westerlies are what's causing the cloudy weather and the rainy weather that we are experiencing here right at the moment. What the Indian meteorologists call the westerly disturbance. Quite why it's a disturbance, I don't know. And then also on the right, the East Asian monsoon, which is coming in all the way from the Pacific. You might think the Pacific Ocean is a long way away. It is. And yet the heating of the Tibetan Plateau draws both the South Asian monsoon and the East Asian monsoon deep inland. And this again is just another way of showing that. On the left is the flow of air and cloud and water and rain and snow in the summer, drawn in by the heating of Tibet. And on the right is winter, where the flow of air is reversed. So the very nature of Tibet has, it really is the engine of the climate of the whole of Asia. So whether, wherever you come from in Asia, Tibet has a really profound influence on the whole of the climate. And of course, at a time like this, when the climate is changing rapidly, that's increasingly dangerous, because all the evidence collected by Chinese scientists in Tibet is that the entire Tibetan plateau is warming rapidly, the permafrost is melting, the glaciers are melting, the rainfall is increasing, especially in the driest parts of Tibet, that is Western Tibet. And the Chinese meteorologists and other people say, well, this is a dividend, a payoff. As the lakes rise, the rivers rise, the flooding rises, the outflow of water rises, this is beneficial for lowland China. At least for the next 3-4 decades, until the glaciers are all gone, China is actually enjoying extra water. And this does not give them strong incentive to do the right thing by the entire planet, to reduce their emissions, which we all know are the cause of the climate crisis. Yet one more way of just showing the cycle, how it just goes round and round, and brings the cycle really through to the whole of Asia. But here we are in India. So let's take a closer look at the forecast of the scientists as to what is likely to happen in the next few decades. And they are forecasting, and we are already experiencing this, basically that rainfall will increase, the monsoon will intensify, but also become much less predictable. I'm sure we know that only a few months ago, most of Pakistan was flooded, underwater. And yet, at the same moment, eastern China was in drought. The East Asian monsoon that comes to China, the Meiyu, the plumflower rains that normally come at much the same time, a little bit later, maybe a month later. The monsoon in India, as I'm sure you know, comes generally in June. And a month later, the East Asian monsoon comes in from the Pacific. Last year it failed. It failed completely. It never arrived. And eastern China experienced the most extreme drought they have ever experienced. And yet at the same time, Pakistan was drowning. And that, I think, is a really sort of strong illustration of the forces at work as Tibet changes, the Tibetan climate changes, the glaciers melt, the permafrost melts, and everything changes. So let's move on, and I'll spend the rest of this presentation looking a bit more closely, not at the roof and not at the oceans, but at the mid-level, and ask, what is China doing about all of this? What is China's plan to repair Tibet and ensure that there really is a future for nature and for human use of the Tibetan plateau? And I think we may have already seen from some of the maps that Tibetan plateau is actually an enormous area. It's the same area roughly as the size of the whole of Western Europe, for example. So if we think of Western Europe, if we want to go, say, from Spain to the Polish border, or from Greece to Sweden, it's a long way. It's a big area. It's 30 countries. And the same goes for Tibet, and we'll look at a couple more maps in a moment. But China has announced that it will legislate a Qinghai Tibet Plateau ecological conservation law. And this is an interesting innovation because at the moment, politically, the Tibetan Plateau is split into 5 of China's 31 provinces. It's quite fragmented and divided, and according to the Tibetan cultural traditions, Tibetans have always seen themselves as belonging to Chokasum, 3 provinces. Central Tibet, Yutang, Northern Tibet, Amdo, and Eastern Tibet, Kham. And even right now, the Tibetan Parliament in exile is in session, and the representatives are elected on the basis of which one of those 3 provinces within the Tibetan Plateau they come from, and their families come from. This is the first time China has ever legislated for the entire Tibetan Plateau. That in itself is really quite remarkable. They have even included not only the whole of Tibet Autonomous Region, the whole of Qinghai, the Tibetan prefectures of Gansu, Sichuan and Yunnan provinces, and even a portion of Xinjiang province. So this sounds like, at last, and since it is for the purpose of ecological conservation, this sounds like something really, really positive. And I think I hope you can see the outlines of the Tibetan Plateau on the sort of southwest side of the map of the whole of China, and get a sense of how big it is. Maybe this image, the dotted line on the left, basically is the Tibetan Plateau. So you can see that it is 1/4 of the entire area claimed by China. This is a big deal. people sometimes in Europe, in America, who have no particular connection to Tibet, because Tibet is not in the news very often, they think, oh, Tibet is just some small place. But it's not. It has a major impact on the entire planet, especially climatically. This is what the meteorologists call teleconnections. Tibet is teleconnected to really the entire planetary climate. But what happens in Tibet, since the prevailing winds are westerly, affects the whole of China, and then Japan, and then the North Pacific, and then Alaska, and then Canada, and then the United States, and then right across the Atlantic to Europe. Really, the entire northern hemisphere climate is deeply influenced by Tibet. So what should we make of this new Chinese legislation? Are they sincere about introducing a national law which returns control over the landscapes of Tibet to the national government? Does this mean that they are going to override the provinces? Because traditionally the provinces of China have had control over natural resources, the uses of grassland and forests, governing livestock, farming, land use, etc. So here are some of the most famous antelopes and gazelles of Tibet, which are completely at home in the snow. Will they now be protected? Is China serious about protection? This is my second last slide, so in a moment we can pause and discuss. So please, if you have any questions or anything you'd like to know further, do ask in a moment when I finish the slides. I'm just giving you advance notice to take a moment to sort of think about it. So we'll just look at the last two slides first. When we look at this new legislation, which has not yet gone the entire process through China's National People's Congress, China's parliament, but it's making progress, and it will probably become law by the middle of this year. So it's going to happen quite soon. And now, when you look very carefully, it specifically talks about the removal of nomads, even though, and the phrase they use is strengthening grazing prohibition, which means that you are not that Tibetan nomads and their traditional skillful custodianship or guardianship of the land, which in their own self-interest has always been and has to be sustainable. How could Tibetans have lived in this land for thousands of years, and the archaeological evidence is now talking about 10, 20, 30,000 years of human use of the Tibetan plateau, and at least 10,000 years of livestock grazing, nomadic grazing. Why were the Tibetans nomads? To be a nomad means you are willing to live with very few possessions because you must be mobile. Why must you be mobile? To stop the grass from being overgrazed. It's that simple. It's really what it comes down to. The simplest and most effective technique for ensuring that there is no land degradation, no erosion, no loss of productivity, no death of the grasses, is simply to be out there on the pastoral landscape with your animals and carefully watch and observe. You're not just out there to daydream or to protect your animals from wolves, although that is an essential part of being a nomad. You are there to check how much grass have your animals eaten. When should you move on? Those are the really basic core decisions that Tibetan nomads, Drokpa, make routinely, daily, in order to protect their own livelihood as well as protecting wildlife, because after all, wildlife, if Tibet was a land without fences, the wildlife could migrate. The chiru, the antelopes we saw a moment ago, would mingle with the yaks, the sheep, the goats of the nomads, and everybody was able to live with each other. But this new legislation, which has many problems, and many Chinese conservation biologists have been quite critical of how much politics has taken over the actual wording of this legislation. But from a Tibetan point of view, this grazing prohibition, in Chinese, twe'e mo huan cao, to close pastures to grow more grass. That's the Chinese slogan. So the end result is this. Here is a convoy of bright, shiny new buses taking Tibetans from their homeland to a newly constructed Xiaokang, moderately prosperous village, constructed at a much lower altitude in a completely different part of Tibet to where they are from. And of course, in the process of this compulsory removal, which is going on all the time, the nomads lose their land rights, their land tenure, they lose their livestock. They have to either sell their livestock or slaughter them. They are not allowed to take them with them. And in the new settlements, there's no room for animals. They have to lead an urban life dependent on handouts from Chinese authorities. And remarkably, this picture is taken from the Chinese Communist Party's top publication, Chusha, the Seeking Truth, the Communist Party's theory journal. So this is not, Tibetan propaganda, this is Chinese propaganda. They're proud of it. So I think that's quite enough from me. So let's open it up for discussion, and I think we already have one question waiting.
Okay, first of all, thank you so much for enlightening us with your cutting-edge knowledge. As you have said, it is by and large the Tibetan environment have the repercussion across the northern hemisphere.
Mm-hmm.
But lately, in one of the article, the Amazon deforestation, they have the repercussion back at the Tibet. So is it correlated with the westerlies disturbance and then finally to the Tibet? How do you think, because in your presentation you said it's mostly the northern hemisphere, but I see some correlation at the equatorial and the southern hemisphere as well.
Yes, I think that's right. I think your question takes us right to the frontier of scientific knowledge. I mean, one of the reasons why the climate crisis took such a long time before people realized that there is a climate crisis, and it took even longer before people accepted that we must do something about it, because the evidence takes a long time to build up, and particularly evidence connecting the way one part of the world influences another part of the world across the skies, especially through the jet stream, which is much higher than the mountains, but which flow right around the planet constantly. And what the scientists are now saying is that when there is an extreme drought or extreme floods or other extreme weather events, it's often because the jet stream high above us, which is a really powerful river, a river of wind, air, circulating the globe constantly, it's weakening as a result of climate change. And as it weakens, it wanders. It's no longer just going whoosh in a straight line because there's so much energy. It's sort of wandering, so it goes up and down. And when it goes up in the northern hemisphere, that means that warm air comes up into frozen regions where we would not expect to get warm air. So last year we had temperatures of 40 degrees in Siberia. Who could expect such a thing? And then sometimes the jet stream wanders down, and cold air from the Arctic, comes to, let's say, Texas in America, and they experience blizzards and snowstorms in a land which is normally hot. Now, the jet stream has always had, before the climate crisis, one part of the planet where it always wanders, always meanders, and that is the Tibetan Plateau. The Tibetan Plateau is an enormous island in the sky that is so high and so big that it diverts the jet stream around it. Tibet is so high that the jet stream does not go up and over it, it goes around it. In summer, the jet stream diverts around the southern edge of Tibet, around the base of the Himalayas, which is more or less where we are right now. In the winter, the jet stream suddenly switches and diverts around the northern edge of Tibet. So that's one reason why Tibet is absolutely central to the climate future of the planet. What the climate scientists are now finding, and this takes enormous amounts of data and enormous amounts of computers capable of crunching the data, analysing the data, looking for patterns in the data. So again, this is something that's only happened very recently. They are really starting to recognise that what the Tibetan Buddhists have always told us, everything's connected to everything else. The Buddha told us that 2,500 years ago, but science is just catching up. So yes, the Amazon forests and Tibet are connected. Teleconnections is the word that the meteorologists use. The Chinese meteorologists are now saying we can even see teleconnections between Tibet and the ice sheet of West Antarctica, which is, in the other hemisphere. It is about as far from Tibet as possible. So if there are these connections and, evidence that they are connected is growing rapidly now, Tibet in every sense is central to this story. I mean, Tibet is quite literally the centre of the whole of Eurasia, and when it is exceedingly, unusually, scarily dry in Tibet, it is also dry across West Asia, the Middle East, and in fact all the way to France. The scientists again have sort of mapped patterns that show that the entire landscape from France through Central and Eastern Europe, across Turkey and the Caucasus and Iraq and Iran and Afghanistan and the Tibetan Plateau are all one teleconnected unit. When France is dry, Tibet is dry. When there are flooding rains in France, there are flooding rains in Tibet. This is amazing. This is new. This is, the latest advances in science. I'm telling you now something that was published 3 days ago, but in a very reputable scientific journal. So I'm prepared to accept their findings. So I think, I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
So as the glaciers melt away, what's actually replacing it? Is it grasslands or deserts? Is it different across Tibet?
Again, that's a very good question. The glaciers are at very high altitude, usually. Sometimes the big glaciers come down to, they're very long, but they've been retreating back uphill for many decades now. You can see in the background of this picture that what is surrounding the glaciers is bare rock. The glaciers are almost always too high for plants. So, we can look at maps of Tibet and say, here is the vegetation line. And we can look even lower, and here's the forest line. But once we go above the vegetation line, it's all bare rock. It is simply too high, the air is too thin, it is too cold, the ground is frozen. It's not just the ice, it's the earth itself that is frozen, and generally at these high altitudes it remains frozen all year. At lower altitudes the freezing is in winter, but the water in the earth, in the soil, may melt in the summer, and that again is changing rapidly, which has all sorts of environmental consequences. But here at the altitude of the glaciers, it's very much bare rock, and as I said earlier, bare rock with no vegetation, under intense solar radiation, sunlight. As spring arrives and the sun comes back from the southern hemisphere to the northern hemisphere, all of this rock heats up, and it heats up very quickly, and that is the engine of the monsoon. That's what draws the monsoon in. And because it's bare rock, and it's still rising, this is a young land. This is a land that is still rising roughly at the same rate that your fingernails grow. You might think, well, my fingernails don't grow very fast, but over a year, over 10 years, over 100 years, over geological time, it's very, very significant. So Tibet is vulnerable. It's very vulnerable for this reason to climate change. If there were grasslands or forests everywhere in Tibet, maybe the impact would not be quite so great. But so much of Tibet, we should never forget that the average altitude of Tibet on the plains, on the plateau, I'm not talking about the mountains, the average altitude of Tibet is 5,000 meters in the west and 4,000 meters in the east. Tibet slopes very, very slowly and gradually from west to east. But the mountains, I mean, we all know that the tallest, the greatest, biggest mountains in the world are in Tibet. You know, the highest mountains are almost 8,000 metres. That's extraordinary. That's 8 kilometres high. Amazing. So, of course, they have an extraordinary influence on the climate, and they need protection. And instead, China is actually actively and proudly removing those traditional custodians, guardians of the land, precisely on the ground that these are primitive barbarians, ignorant, uneducated, illiterate people who are selfishly causing land degradation, eroding the land because they have no understanding of anything really. In fact, they not only follow their animals, they are really leading a life like an animal. There's not much difference in Chinese eyes between the nomads who just, wander hither and thither, as we say in India. There's not much difference between the Drogpa nomads and the animals. They are all, again, to use a classic Chinese phrase, depending on the sky, which from a Chinese point of view means they are passive, not dominating nature, not mastering nature, and therefore uncivilized. Civilized people don't let their animals wander and just wander with them. Civilized people put their animals inside a pen. They build a fence and they bring the food to the animals. From a Chinese perspective, that is actually the way they define the beginning of civilization. So the Tibetans are clearly uncivilized. They don't have fences. Oh, they don't have many fences. Of course, they bring their animals in winter behind a fence so that the animals can huddle together to survive the winter when there's no grass growing. But from a Chinese perspective, that's not good enough. You need proper fences and proper pasture management and tractors to carry the feed to the animals to show that you're a civilized person. I'm sorry for giving such a long answer. I get a bit carried away at times. Anybody else? Zenola.
What do you think about the recent kind of Chinese expansionist policies when it comes to Tibet major rivers at its disposal? So whether so-called environmentalists or those meteorologists or people who have researched deeply in this kind of climatic condition changes. Is there any concrete kind of result to pass a bill or maybe kind of law on these things? I was just wondering.
Again, we could talk forever. I've got to be careful, and maybe we should make this the last question so that people can get on with. I hope if you haven't already looked at this wonderful new museum, please do. It's really quite remarkable. Expansionist policies. Well, China is really interested in exploiting the resources of Tibet. And since we've been talking about climate change and how important it is to decarbonize the world, that in itself is a major reason why China is now saying, well, now the world will use green technology, and this will be wonderful. This is a simple, straightforward, beneficial answer to all the problems of an industrial civilization, worldwide industrial civilization that depends on coal and oil and fossil fuels. But what does that mean for Tibet? It means that there will be increased exploitation of the copper, gold, silver, molybdenum, lithium deposits of Tibet, because China needs them all, whether it is to, make the small lithium battery in your phone, or whether it is to make the very big, heavy lithium battery in your electric car, and the electricity that charges up that lithium battery that drives your car. Where does the electricity come from? It again will come from hydro dams in Tibet, solar farms in Tibet, wind farms in Tibet, and of course the lithium extraction. So there are many aspects to this, and I don't want to give a long answer. I think I've said enough. But I do wonder whether, just as we now regret our ignorant foolishness in thinking that a fossil fuel economy can just go on forever, which we've discovered is extremely dangerous, whether we'll discover that so-called green energy, we just swap one technology for a new technology and everything will be good, and we can continue to lead the same lifestyle that we've always led, and there will be no problem because technology always provides the solution. I don't think the world is quite that simple, and I think one day we will look at Tibet and realise that Tibet was really deeply exploited in a way that is not at all helpful for anyone or for the planet. So maybe I hope that's enough for you, Tenola. So can I just add one thing? I publish information about all of these issues on a regular basis on a blog called Rukor, R-U-K-O-R, www.rukor.org. Rukor is an old Tibetan term for a gathering of nomadic tents when nomads get together to make that key decision. When is the right time to move on? When is the right time to make sure that we don't overgraze and destroy the grasslands? So if you want to know more, there are many, many sources, and I'm currently with the Tibet Policy Institute, who are doing really good work on all of these issues. So there are many sources, but my own writings are on rukor.org, rukor.org. So I think I should leave it there. Thank you very much for your patience, and special thanks to Tibet Museum for providing this wonderful new space and such an inspiring museum. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Abdullah. So actually, yeah, okay. So after this we have like tea break, so please make sure they don't mix it up. Okay, so without taking time, I just would like to call upon our director, Mr. Tenzin Totinla, to conclude today's session. Thank you for coming.
I think I don't need to conclude, because we have already heard a lot, and as he have already said, if you want to know more about his passion, his love towards the environment, please go to rukor.org. He regularly publish, and most of these, the findings are really cutting edge, and I should say he is a fearless writer, because writing against the China need really strong, and you are really helping all of us. And also I would like to tell all of you that we have been knowing since 2019, end of the 2019, but primarily on the working of this new museum project, not physically but through mail. He has given us a lot of resources regarding the environment section that you are seeing right now. and this time I'm very happy to meet you personally, and I'm looking forward to collaborate with you to utilize your knowledge to build up more, I should say, the temporary exhibition that we are planning. And also I must say that whatever you're doing is really you are accumulating a lot of merit, because one of the main commitment of His Holiness Dalai Lama, out of his 4 main commitment, one is regarding the fragile ecology of Tibet, because we need people to advocate that the ecology. There are a lot of corporate and there are a lot of short gaming that are happening, and what they undermine is the ecology. So people like you are really helpful, and in terms of Buddhism we should say you have accrued a lot of karmic value, and thank you so much for that. And also to apprise all of you again, we regularly host these kind of the talk series 2 times in a month. 1 month we try to engage our in-house research, researchers, which is from the Tibet Policy Institute, and another one we always try to search from the outside. So this Friday we are also lucky to have Ms. Pentokla, who will be talking on the synthesization of the Buddhism. So I hope all of you will again join us. It is in Tibetan language, but of course later on we can subtitle them and put in the YouTube. And thank you so much for coming here and supporting us. I would like to once again thank you, the Gabriela. And after this, I would like to then offer as a small presentation. Please give a big round of applause to Mr. Gabriel. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Token.
And this is a small token.
Okay.